Evelyn Harper had never told her son that she earned nearly $40,000 a month. To Daniel, she was simply his quiet, middle-aged mother who lived alone in a modest apartment in Boston, carried the same worn leather handbag for years, bought clothes from discount stores, and worked what appeared to be an ordinary office job. That was exactly how Evelyn wanted it. She had spent decades building a life no one fully understood. While other executives bought mansions, luxury cars, and designer jewelry, Evelyn invested her money, lived quietly, and watched the world carefully. She believed true wealth should protect your peace, not advertise itself to strangers. But everything changed the afternoon Daniel called her, sounding nervous. "Mom," he had said carefully, "Claire's parents are visiting from overseas this weekend. They want to meet you. We're having dinner Saturday night at the Grand Marlowe." The Grand Marlowe, one of the most expensive restaurants in Beacon Hill. Evelyn immediately noticed the hesitation in his voice, the embarrassment. "Did you tell them anything about me?" she asked calmly. There was silence. Then Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "I told them you're simple, that you work in an office and live quietly. Nothing complicated. Simple." The word stayed in Evelyn's mind long after the call ended, not because it offended her, but because she recognized the warning hidden inside it. Daniel was afraid his wealthy in-laws would judge her, and instinctively, Evelyn knew they probably would. So she made a decision. If Claire Bennett's family wanted to meet a poor, ordinary woman, then that was exactly who Evelyn Harper would become for one night. She chose the oldest dress in her closet, a shapeless gray thing she normally wore while cleaning the apartment. She paired it with worn shoes, removed every piece of jewelry, tied her hair back carelessly, and grabbed an old canvas tote bag instead of her leather purse. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Perfect. She wanted to see how people behaved when they thought someone had nothing. But the moment Evelyn stepped inside that glowing restaurant beneath the crystal chandeliers of Beacon Hill, everything changed. Because by the end of that dinner, Claire's parents would humiliate themselves in front of everyone. Daniel's marriage would nearly collapse, and Evelyn Harper would finally stop pretending to be smaller than she really was. On weekday mornings, Evelyn Harper woke up at 5:30 without an alarm. 40 years of discipline had trained her body better than any clock ever could. Her apartment was small but comfortable, located inside an aging brick building on a quiet street in Boston. The furniture was old but clean. Nothing matched perfectly. There were no expensive paintings on the walls, no marble countertops, no signs that the woman living there controlled regional operations for one of the largest logistics corporations in North America. That was intentional. Evelyn moved quietly through the apartment, preparing black coffee while the city outside slowly woke beneath a pale gray sunrise. She wore soft cotton pajamas and fuzzy slippers that had probably survived longer than most marriages. Her phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. A message from her assistant. Monday board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Singapore team joining remotely. Evelyn typed a quick response confirming the schedule, then placed the phone down beside her mug. To the outside world, she was powerful. Inside corporate offices across 5 countries, people stood when she entered rooms. Executives twice her size became nervous presenting reports in front of her. She managed hundreds of millions of dollars every year and signed contracts capable of changing entire regional markets. But Daniel had never seen any of that. Her son believed she worked somewhere in administration, something stable, something small, and Evelyn had allowed him to believe it his entire life. Not because she was ashamed, because she was careful. She had raised Daniel alone after his father disappeared before he was born. She remembered what poverty felt like. She remembered crying in grocery stores while calculating whether she could afford both milk and medicine in the same week. Money changed people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes instantly. She had seen ambitious young employees become arrogant the moment they tasted success. She had watched families destroy themselves fighting over inheritance. She had seen kindness disappear behind luxury cars and expensive watches. Evelyn refused to let that happen to her son. So Daniel grew up believing hard work mattered more than status. And most days, Evelyn felt proud of the man he became. Daniel worked as an architect now. Independent, intelligent, humble. He paid his own bills, built his own career, and never once asked his mother for financial help. That mattered more to Evelyn than any promotion she had ever received. Her thoughts drifted toward Claire Bennett, Daniel's wife. Claire herself was sweet enough, though a little too concerned with appearances sometimes. Expensive dinners, designer handbags, luxury vacations carefully displayed online. But it was Claire's parents who unsettled Evelyn. Victoria and Richard Bennett. Everything about them sounded loud, too polished, too proud, too eager to prove themselves. And Daniel's nervous phone call the day before only confirmed her suspicions. Simple. Evelyn stared into her coffee thoughtfully. No, this dinner was not simply a family meeting. It was an evaluation. And Evelyn intended to conduct one of her own. Later that evening, she stood inside her bedroom staring into her closet. Silk blouses, tailored jackets, cashmere coats, quiet luxury hidden behind ordinary hangers. Then she reached toward the very back, toward the oldest gray dress she owned. And slowly, Evelyn Harper smiled. Saturday evening arrived cold and windy. The kind of Boston night where the streets shimmered beneath reflections of gold city lights and expensive windows. Evelyn Harper stood in front of her apartment mirror one last time. The wrinkled gray dress hung loosely from her shoulders. Her worn shoes looked slightly faded beneath the hallway light. She had tied her silver-streaked hair into a careless ponytail and removed even the tiny pearl earrings she usually wore. She looked tired, ordinary, forgettable. Exactly as planned, Evelyn grabbed her old canvas tote bag and headed downstairs. The taxi ride to Beacon Hill took nearly 20 minutes. As the neighborhoods changed, so did the atmosphere outside the window. Small grocery stores disappeared. Brick apartment buildings gave way to elegant brownstones, luxury boutiques, and glowing restaurants where valet attendants stood outside beneath heaters and polished lights. The Grand Marlowe sat on the corner like a palace. Tall windows, crystal chandeliers, white-gloved doormen. The kind of place where people didn't ask about prices because everyone inside wanted others to believe money meant nothing to them. Evelyn paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The doorman opened the heavy glass entrance slowly, though his eyes lingered briefly on her clothes. There it is, Evelyn thought calmly. The first judgment of the evening. Inside, warm piano music floated through the restaurant, while wealthy guests laughed softly over wine glasses and candlelight. Every table glowed beneath golden lamps, and near the back window, Daniel immediately spotted her. His face changed instantly. Not anger, not shame exactly, but discomfort. The same discomfort people showed when reality threatened the image they had carefully built for others. "Mom," he said quickly, standing from the table. "You came." "Of course I came," Evelyn answered gently. Daniel kissed her cheek, but his nervous eyes scanned her dress, shoes, and old tote bag within seconds. Beside him sat Claire Bennett, beautiful as always, perfectly styled blonde hair, cream-colored dress, diamond earrings. Claire smiled politely, though the smile looked tight around the edges. "Hi, Evelyn," she said softly. "It's good to see you." Then came the real introduction. Claire turned toward the elegant couple seated across the table. "Mom, Dad, this is Daniel's mother." Victoria Bennett looked Evelyn up and down in complete silence. That silence lasted only 2 seconds. But Evelyn had spent decades in executive boardrooms. She knew how to read people faster than most psychologists. And in those 2 seconds, she saw everything. Disappointment, judgment, superiority. Victoria wore an emerald silk dress covered in subtle beadwork that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. Beside her, Richard Bennett sat stiffly in a tailored charcoal suit, a heavy gold watch gleaming beneath the restaurant lights. Victoria extended her hand with a smile that never reached her eyes. "It's lovely to finally meet you." Her tone translated differently. "So this is her?" Evelyn shook her hand lightly. "You too." Richard nodded politely, but didn't stand. Daniel pulled out a chair for his mother at the far end of the table. Not beside him, not beside Claire. At the end, separated. Interesting, Evelyn thought. A waiter arrived carrying oversized leather menus written entirely in French. Victoria glanced toward Evelyn. "Oh," she said lightly. "Would you like help reading the menu?" The question sounded innocent. It wasn't. Evelyn lowered her eyes slightly and smiled with practiced softness. "Yes, please. I don't really understand these fancy places." Victoria exchanged a tiny glance with Richard. A silent conversation, exactly what they expected. "Well," Victoria said while flipping through the menu, "some things here can be a little excessive. Let's choose something simple for you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Claire stared down at her napkin, and Evelyn sat quietly, watching every single person at the table reveal themselves, one sentence at a time. The waiter returned for drink orders. Richard ordered a $200 bottle of wine without even looking at the price. Victoria smiled proudly. "This vineyard is private. she explained while glancing toward Evelyn. You can only access it through invitation. We discovered it while vacationing in France last year. How lovely, Evelyn replied softly. Victoria leaned back elegantly. We travel constantly, she continued. Europe, Switzerland, Italy, South America. We believe experiences define people. Then her eyes settled carefully on Evelyn again. And you? Victoria asked sweetly. Do you travel much? Evelyn lowered her water glass slowly before answering Victoria's question. And you? Victoria repeated smoothly. Do you travel much? Evelyn smiled apologetically. Oh no, she said softly. Not really. I've never been outside the country. Traveling is expensive. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There it is again, Evelyn thought. Pity, the dangerous kind. Not compassion, not empathy. The kind of pity wealthy people used when they wanted to feel superior while pretending to be kind. Victoria reached for her wine glass delicately. Well, she sighed dramatically. Not everyone values experiences the same way, I suppose. Richard chuckled lightly beside her. Some people prefer simpler lives. Daniel immediately grabbed his own water glass, clearly trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. Claire remained quiet, too quiet. Evelyn noticed every small thing. The way Claire's fingers twisted nervously around her napkin. The way Daniel's shoulders stiffened each time Victoria spoke. The way Richard constantly mentioned prices without directly mentioning prices. The appetizers arrived. Tiny artistic portions, placed carefully on oversized white plates. Victoria immediately began narrating the restaurant's exclusivity. The chef trained in Paris for 7 years, she explained. Reservations here take months. Richard had to call a personal contact to get this table. How impressive, Evelyn replied gently. Victoria smiled, as though rewarded. And the wine, Richard added, lifting the bottle slightly, is from a private collection. $200 a bottle. But quality matters. Evelyn nodded politely. Of course. Then Victoria tilted her head toward Evelyn again. So, Evelyn, she asked sweetly, what exactly do you do for work? Daniel's eyes instantly lifted. A warning. But Evelyn ignored it. I work in an office, she answered quietly. What kind of office? Richard asked. Oh, administrative things mostly. Paperwork, scheduling. Nothing important. Victoria exchanged another glance with her husband. That silent language again. They had already categorized her completely. Middle-aged, financially average, socially unimportant, harmless. How admirable, Victoria said with practiced politeness. Hardworking people deserve respect. The sentence sounded kind, but Evelyn heard the hidden translation beneath it. You are beneath us, but we are gracious enough to acknowledge your existence. The main courses arrived soon after. Richard ordered imported steak. Victoria ordered sea bass flown in from Greece. Claire barely touched her food. Daniel drank too much water, and Evelyn quietly ate the cheapest dish Victoria had selected for her. Then came the real performance. Victoria leaned back comfortably in her chair. You know, she began casually, Richard and I have always believed family should support family. Daniel froze instantly. Evelyn noticed. Interesting. We helped Claire and Daniel tremendously after the wedding, Victoria continued proudly. The house down payment, of course, their honeymoon in Italy, furniture, renovations. Richard nodded with satisfaction. Young couples need stability. That was very generous, Evelyn replied calmly. Victoria smiled warmly now, almost maternally. We believe successful parents should help their children rise higher. The sentence floated carefully through the air. Then came the knife hidden inside silk. And you? Victoria asked lightly. Were you able to help Daniel much? Daniel looked down immediately. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Evelyn almost smiled. So this is what tonight really is. A little, Evelyn answered softly. Not much. I did what I could. Victoria sighed sympathetically. Well, every contribution matters, Richard added casually. Though financial pressure can become difficult later in life. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Victoria's voice became smoother now, controlled. Prepared. We simply worry about Daniel carrying too much responsibility, she explained. He's such a kind man. Sometimes kind men feel obligated to care for everyone around them. Daniel finally spoke. Victoria, I think... She raised a manicured hand gently. Please, Daniel, we're just having an honest family conversation. Family. Interesting choice of word. Victoria leaned closer toward Evelyn, with false warmth shining in her eyes. We understand your situation must be difficult sometimes, she said softly. Living alone, working at your age, managing bills. Boston is expensive. Evelyn remained silent. And Richard and I discussed something before tonight, Victoria continued. Perhaps we could help you a little. Daniel's face turned pale. Claire whispered quietly, Mom. But Victoria continued anyway. A modest monthly allowance, she said. Just enough to make life easier. Maybe $600 or $700 a month. Evelyn slowly placed her fork down. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter. You're very generous, she said carefully. Victoria smiled proudly. We simply think young couples deserve freedom to build their lives without unnecessary pressures or emotional obligations. There it was. Finally. Clear, sharp. Ugly. They were offering money for her disappearance. Richard folded his hands comfortably. And naturally, he added, it would help if you gave Daniel and Claire a little space moving forward. Daniel pushed his chair back suddenly. That's enough. But Evelyn gently lifted one hand. No, not yet, because now the real dinner was finally beginning. The silence around the table thickened instantly after Daniel pushed back his chair. That's enough, he repeated, his voice sharper this time. Victoria blinked at him in surprise, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. Daniel, she said calmly, your father and I are simply trying to help. No, he snapped quietly. You're insulting my mother. Richard's expression darkened slightly. You're misunderstanding the situation. Evelyn lifted her hand again, gently. Sit down, Daniel. Her son looked at her uncertainly. Mom, please. Something in her voice made him obey immediately. Victoria relaxed again, reassured by what she still believed was Evelyn's weakness. Poor woman. Embarrassed woman. Grateful woman. Evelyn folded her napkin carefully beside her plate and leaned back in her chair for the first time all evening. And when she finally spoke again, her voice sounded different, still calm, but no longer small. No one has ever offered to pay me to disappear before, Evelyn said lightly. Victoria gave an uncomfortable laugh. That's not what we meant, isn't it? Richard crossed his arms. We're talking about relieving pressure from the young couple. By removing me? Victoria sighed dramatically. Evelyn, please don't make this emotional. That sentence almost made Evelyn smile. 40 years. 40 years surviving corporate warfare disguised as polite conversation. She had negotiated with billionaires, dismantled executives twice as ruthless as Richard Bennett, and ended careers with a single sentence spoken calmly across conference tables. And these people thought she frightened easily. Interesting. Evelyn picked up her water glass slowly. Tell me something, Victoria, she said. Do you believe money makes people valuable? Victoria hesitated. Of course not. But it certainly helps, Richard added casually. There it is again. Honesty hidden inside arrogance. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. I see. Victoria leaned forward slightly. You have to understand where we're coming from. Claire grew up with stability, security, opportunity. We simply want to ensure she continues having that kind of life. And you believe I threaten that? Evelyn asked softly. Victoria opened her mouth carefully. We believe financial burdens can create strain in marriages. Daniel looked sick now. Claire stared silently at the table, shame burning visibly across her face. Evelyn turned toward her son for a moment. Daniel, she asked quietly, have I ever asked you for money? No, he answered immediately. Have I ever depended on you financially? Never. Have I ever interfered in your marriage? Daniel swallowed hard. No. Evelyn nodded once. Then she turned back toward Victoria. So this conversation is not about reality, she said calmly. It's about assumptions. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. You came here dressed like... Like what? Evelyn interrupted softly. No one answered. Like poor, like small, like unimportant. Evelyn could practically hear the unfinished sentence hanging above the table. She leaned back again. You know, she said thoughtfully, I grew up with absolutely nothing. Victoria blinked, surprised by the shift. Evelyn continued calmly. My father drank away every paycheck he ever earned. My mother cleaned hotel bathrooms until arthritis destroyed her hands. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment with leaking ceilings and broken heat. The table remained silent now. No one interrupted. At 23, Evelyn continued, I became pregnant. The father left before Daniel was born. My family told me I ruined my life. Daniel slowly looked up at his mother. He had never heard the story in detail before. Evelyn kept speaking. I worked mornings at a shipping office, nights at a grocery store. I studied accounting from library books because I couldn't afford classes. Victoria's confident posture slowly weakened. I slept 3 hours some nights, Evelyn said. There were weeks I ate almost nothing so Daniel could eat properly. Claire looked close to tears now. And eventually, Evelyn continued softly, I climbed higher. Assistant, supervisor, operations manager, regional director. Richard frowned slightly. Regional director? For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared on his face. Evelyn looked directly into Victoria's eyes. You spent this entire dinner measuring my value based on my shoes, my dress, and my apartment. Victoria said nothing. And the fascinating part, Evelyn continued calmly, is that neither of you ever asked whether I was happy. Silence. You asked about money, Evelyn said, about travel, about appearances, but never character, never peace, never love. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's face had slowly begun losing color. Then Evelyn reached calmly into her old canvas tote bag and pulled out a sleek black card holder. Daniel's eyes widened immediately because he recognized it before anyone else did. Evelyn slid one black metal corporate card slowly across the white tablecloth. The silver lettering gleamed beneath the restaurant lights. Evelyn Harper, Regional Operations Director. No one spoke, not even the waiter walking past nearby. Victoria stared at the card as if it might explode. Richard's confident expression cracked completely, and Daniel whispered only one word, Mom? The table fell into complete silence. Victoria stared at the black card as though her eyes refused to process what they were seeing. Richard leaned forward slightly, reading the engraved silver lettering again and again. Regional Operations Director. Daniel still looked frozen, and Claire's face had gone completely pale. Finally, Victoria laughed nervously. This is ridiculous, she said too quickly. What exactly is this supposed to mean? Evelyn folded her hands calmly in her lap. It means, she replied softly, that you spent the entire evening humiliating a woman you knew absolutely nothing about. Richard straightened immediately. You deceived us. No, Evelyn corrected calmly. I observed you. Victoria's voice sharpened. You intentionally came here pretending to be poor. Yes. And you think that's normal? Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I think what's abnormal is offering money to remove someone from their own son's life. Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel finally found his voice. You really said that, he whispered toward Claire's parents. You actually offered my mother an allowance to disappear? Richard exhaled heavily. You're twisting the conversation. No, Evelyn said quietly. I remember it perfectly. Then she looked directly at Victoria. You asked whether my salary was enough to survive. Victoria's cheeks reddened. You implied I was a burden. Silence. You selected the cheapest food on the menu for me. Victoria looked away. And the fascinating part, Evelyn continued calmly, is that you enjoyed doing it. Claire suddenly covered her face with one trembling hand. Mom, please stop. Victoria snapped toward her daughter immediately. Claire, do not start acting dramatic. That single sentence changed something inside Daniel instantly. Evelyn saw it happen in real time. The disappointment, the realization, the breaking point. Daniel leaned forward slowly. No, he said quietly. She's not being dramatic. You humiliated my mother all night. Victoria's expression hardened again. We were trying to protect your future. From what? Daniel asked. A woman who never asked us for anything? Richard crossed his arms tightly. We had every reason to believe she was financially unstable. And if she had been? Evelyn asked softly. Richard fell silent. There it is. The real answer. If she had actually been poor, they would have considered her less valuable. Evelyn leaned back calmly. You know what's interesting? She asked. I never judged either of you for loving money. Victoria frowned. Excuse me? I understand poverty trauma, Evelyn continued quietly. I understand fear. I understand wanting security after suffering. Claire slowly looked up. But this? Evelyn gestured lightly around the table. This isn't security anymore. It's worship. Richard scoffed. You're lecturing us after lying all evening? Evelyn smiled faintly. My lie exposed the truth. No one answered, because everyone at the table knew she was right. Victoria suddenly straightened again. desperately trying to regain control. "Well," she said coldly, "if you're truly this successful, why live the way you do? Why that apartment? Why those clothes?" Evelyn answered immediately, "Because I have nothing to prove." Silence again. "I don't need strangers admiring me to feel successful," Evelyn said softly. "And I certainly don't need money to make me feel superior to others." Claire began crying quietly now. Real tears, not embarrassment. Shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered toward Evelyn. "I should have said something earlier." Evelyn looked at her gently. "Yes," she replied honestly. "You should have." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. Then Richard abruptly reached for the leather check holder the waiter had just placed beside the wine bottle. "I think this dinner has gone far enough." He pulled out a thick wallet filled with polished credit cards and selected one aggressively. The waiter returned moments later and accepted it politely. No one spoke while waiting. Victoria sat rigidly. Daniel stared blankly at the tablecloth. Claire quietly wiped tears from her face, and Evelyn remained perfectly calm. The waiter returned less than 2 minutes later. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said carefully. "This card was declined." Richard blinked. "What?" The waiter maintained his professional smile. "Would you like to try another form of payment?" Richard immediately handed over a second card. Victoria shifted uncomfortably now. "That's impossible," she muttered. The waiter disappeared again. Daniel slowly looked toward his mother. Evelyn simply took a sip of water. The waiter returned once more. "I apologize again, sir. This one was also declined." Now Richard's face lost color completely. "There must be a bank issue," he snapped. "Run it again." "Of course." The waiter hurried away. Victoria leaned toward her husband urgently. "What's happening?" Richard whispered angrily. "Probably fraud protection." Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to, because humiliation had already taken over the table completely. Finally, after several more painful minutes, Evelyn reached calmly into her bag once again. But this time, she removed a different card. Heavy. Black. Metal. The moment it touched the candlelight, Victoria's eyes widened in horror because she recognized it instantly. An American Express Centurion card, the kind most wealthy people would never even qualify for. Evelyn placed it gently on top of the check holder. Then she smiled politely. "Please," she said softly, "allow the poor woman to pay for dinner." No one stopped Evelyn when she stood up from the table. Not Victoria. Not Richard. Not even Daniel. The entire restaurant seemed quieter now, as though the humiliation surrounding the Bennett family had swallowed the sound out of the room itself. Evelyn picked up her old canvas tote bag calmly and slipped the Centurion card back inside. Victoria stared at her with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You planned this," she whispered bitterly. Evelyn looked at her one final time. "No," she replied softly. "I simply gave you the opportunity to reveal yourselves." Then she turned toward Claire. The young woman looked shattered, mascara slightly smudged, hand trembling in her lap. And for the first time all evening, she looked human instead of polished. Evelyn's voice softened. "You are not your parents, Claire," she said gently. "But you do become responsible for your silence, eventually." Claire lowered her head immediately as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. Daniel stood quickly. "Mom, wait." Evelyn nodded toward the restaurant exit. Outside, cold Boston air wrapped around them instantly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement, while expensive cars rolled past Beacon Hill restaurants glowing behind glass windows. Finally, Daniel exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at him quietly. "For what?" "For all of it," he admitted. "For not seeing what was happening. For letting them treat you that way. For—" his voice cracked slightly. "For never really knowing who you were." Evelyn's expression softened immediately. "Oh, Daniel, you hid everything from me," he said almost helplessly. "Your job, your money, your entire life." "Yes." "Why?" Evelyn looked toward the city lights. "Because I wanted you to build your own life without depending on mine." Daniel frowned. "You could have trusted me." "It wasn't about trust," Evelyn answered calmly. "It was about protection." "Protection from what?" "Entitlement." The word landed heavily between them. Evelyn folded her arms against the cold. "I grew up watching money destroy people," she continued quietly. "Families became cruel. Children became lazy. Love became transactional. I refused to let that happen to you." Daniel stared at her silently now. "I wanted you to struggle a little," Evelyn admitted softly. "To work. to appreciate things, to become strong without believing someone else would rescue you financially every time life became difficult. Daniel shook his head slowly in disbelief. All these years. I know. And you were really making $40,000 a month? Evelyn almost laughed, sometimes more. Daniel covered his face briefly with both hands. Oh my God. That finally made Evelyn smile faintly. For the first time that night, some of the tension loosened between them. A taxi pulled up beside the curb. Daniel opened the door for her automatically. Before getting inside, Evelyn touched his arm gently. Go back to Claire. Daniel hesitated. After tonight? Yes. She stayed silent. She was raised to stay silent, Evelyn corrected carefully. There's a difference. Daniel looked back toward the glowing restaurant windows. I don't know what happens now. You establish boundaries, Evelyn said firmly. And you decide what kind of family you want to become. The taxi driver glanced at them through the mirror. Everything okay? Evelyn nodded politely. Yes, just a long evening. Daniel hugged her suddenly, tightly, like the little boy he used to be before life complicated everything. I love you, Mom. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. I love you too. Then she got into the taxi. As the car pulled away from Beacon Hill, Evelyn leaned back against the seat and finally allowed herself to breathe fully. The adrenaline was fading now. What remained underneath surprised her. Not triumph, not satisfaction, sadness, deep, exhausting sadness. Because she had hoped, despite all her instincts, that Victoria and Richard might prove her wrong. Instead, they had confirmed everything she feared about people who worship status more than humanity. The driver glanced toward her through the rearview mirror. You look like you just survived a war. Evelyn smiled tiredly. Something like that. He nodded knowingly. I've driven people out of those restaurants for 22 years, he said. The rich ones usually leave loud, angry, drunk. You're quiet. What does that mean? It means you said what needed to be said. Evelyn looked out the window thoughtfully. The city blurred past in gold reflections. You know, the driver continued casually, truly rich people never need to announce it. Evelyn slowly turned toward him. Why do you say that? Because the people with real power don't spend all night trying to convince strangers they matter. The words settled deeply inside her. Simple. Honest, true. And suddenly Evelyn realized something. The wisest person she had met that night was not sitting inside the Grand Marlowe beneath crystal chandeliers. It was the man driving an old yellow taxi through cold Boston streets. Evelyn barely slept that night, not because of anger. Anger was easy for her to control. It was disappointment that lingered. She sat by the living room window long after midnight, wearing soft pajamas, a cup of untouched tea cooling slowly in her hands, while Boston's distant city lights flickered across the dark glass. The apartment felt peaceful again, honest, no pretending, no performances, just silence. Around 1 a.m, her phone vibrated softly on the coffee table. A text message from Claire. I'm so sorry. I should have stopped them. I didn't know what to do. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone back down without replying. Some apologies needed time before they became real. The next morning passed quietly until her phone rang again shortly after 10. Daniel. Evelyn answered immediately. Good morning, son. His voice sounded exhausted. Mom, are you busy? No. A pause. Can I come over? Of course. Daniel arrived 40 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was messy, his jaw tense, and dark circles rested beneath his eyes. The moment Evelyn opened the apartment door, he hugged her again. Longer this time. Stronger. I'm sorry, he whispered once more. Evelyn gently rubbed his back. You already apologized. I know. He pulled away slowly. I still can't believe what happened. She guided him toward the kitchen table, where fresh coffee waited. Daniel sat heavily in the chair across from her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Evelyn asked quietly, What happened after I left? Daniel let out a long breath and leaned back. It got ugly. Evelyn wasn't surprised. Victoria immediately blamed you, he continued. She said you manipulated everyone, that you planned the entire thing to humiliate them. Evelyn stirred cream into her coffee calmly. And Richard? He defended her at first, Daniel said bitterly. He kept saying you created a trap. Evelyn almost smiled. The truth always feels like a trap to dishonest people. Daniel nodded slowly. That's basically what I told them. Now Evelyn looked up. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. I told them you didn't force them to insult you. You didn't force them to judge you. You simply gave them the opportunity to show who they really were. Pride warmed Evelyn's chest unexpectedly. And how did they react to that? Daniel laughed humorlessly. Terribly. He rubbed both hands across his face. Victoria started crying. Not real crying, angry crying. The kind where someone feels exposed instead of hurt. Evelyn knew the type well. She kept saying everything she ever did was for Claire. That she sacrificed her entire life to give her opportunities. That she refused to apologize for wanting her daughter surrounded by successful people. And Claire? Daniel became quiet. For several seconds, he simply stared into his coffee cup. Then he spoke softly. She finally snapped. Evelyn blinked. Claire? Daniel nodded slowly. I've never seen her talk to her parents like that before. Something inside Evelyn shifted. Interesting. What happened? Daniel leaned back again. She told them they were cruel. Silence filled the kitchen. She said she watched every comment they made to you. Every look. Every insult disguised as concern. He swallowed hard. And she admitted she was ashamed. Evelyn looked down thoughtfully. She told Victoria that money had made them cold. Daniel continued quietly. That they treated people like social rankings instead of human beings. For the first time since the dinner, Evelyn felt genuine surprise. And Richard? She asked. He exploded. Daniel gave a tired laugh. He started talking about disrespect, loyalty, family reputation. Then he threatened to cut us off financially. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Of course he did. Control always became cruelest when it started losing power. Daniel continued quietly. He said if Claire wanted to betray her family for people beneath them, then maybe they needed to reconsider their will. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Predictable. And Claire? She repeated carefully. Daniel smiled faintly for the first time all morning. She told him to keep the money. Now Evelyn looked up sharply. She said she would rather struggle honestly than live controlled by guilt and financial manipulation. Silence settled heavily between them again. Then Daniel whispered something that surprised even himself. I think last night saved my marriage. Evelyn frowned slightly. How? Because Claire finally saw them clearly. Daniel stared toward the apartment window thoughtfully. She spent her whole life trying to please them. Everything was about appearances, reputation, success. He looked back at Evelyn now. But you terrified them last night. Terrified? You proved money couldn't control you. Evelyn said nothing. Daniel smiled weakly, and I think that broke something inside them. The room became quiet again. Then Daniel reached across the table and gently took his mother's hand. Mom, he said softly. Claire and I made a decision. Evelyn waited calmly. We're setting boundaries. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of boundaries? Daniel's voice became firmer now. No more financial control. No more insults disguised as advice. No more treating people differently based on money. He squeezed her hand gently. And if they can't respect that, then they won't have unlimited access to our lives anymore. For the first time in 2 days, Evelyn finally smiled completely because at that moment, she realized something important. The dinner had not destroyed Daniel and Claire. It had forced them to grow up. Sunday morning arrived unusually warm for early autumn in Boston. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn Harper woke without immediately reaching for her work phone. No emails. No conference calls. No financial reports waiting for approval. Just silence. She stood by the kitchen window, holding a mug of black coffee, while sunlight slowly spilled across the brick buildings outside her apartment. The city below moved at its usual pace. People carrying grocery bags, cyclists rushing past traffic, parents pulling sleepy children toward bakeries and cafes. Life continued, completely indifferent to emotional disasters. And somehow, Evelyn found comfort in that. Around 10 o'clock, she slipped into a pair of old jeans, white sneakers, and a soft navy sweater before leaving the apartment with nothing but her keys and wallet. No makeup, no jewelry. No performance, just herself. The walk toward Riverside Green Park took nearly 20 minutes. Beacon Hill's polished luxury slowly faded behind her while ordinary Boston life replaced it. Food carts, street musicians, crowded sidewalks, couples arguing over coffee, children laughing beside fountains. Real life, messy life. Human life. Evelyn entered the park slowly, breathing in cool morning air mixed with the smell of wet grass and fresh bread drifting from nearby cafes. People filled the walking paths. An elderly man fed ducks near the pond. Teenagers skateboarded loudly near the entrance. A young mother pushed a stroller while balancing 2 coffees in one hand. None of them cared about status. None of them cared about watches or designer labels or private vineyards in France. And suddenly, Evelyn wondered something she had never truly considered before. Were Victoria and Richard Bennett actually happy? They had money, properties, luxury, influence. But did they have peace? Did they know how to sit quietly in a park without trying to prove something to the world? Evelyn found an empty bench beneath a maple tree, glowing orange and gold with autumn leaves. She sat down slowly. For several minutes, she simply watched people. And the more she watched, the lighter she felt. Then an older woman approached, carrying a paper bag filled with breadcrumbs. "Mind if I sit here?" the woman asked warmly. "Not at all." The woman settled beside her carefully. She looked to be in her 80s, small and slightly hunched, wearing a faded brown coat and comfortable walking shoes. Without speaking again, she scattered breadcrumbs across the grass. Within seconds, pigeons gathered around them. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You feed them every week?" "Every Sunday for 11 years, the woman answered proudly. "Ever since my husband died." The honesty of the statement surprised Evelyn slightly. "I'm sorry." The woman waved dismissively. "Oh, don't be. He was 92. At some point, death stops being tragic and starts becoming rude scheduling." That made Evelyn laugh unexpectedly. The older woman smiled triumphantly. "There," she said. "You needed that." Evelyn blinked. "What?" That laugh. The woman studied her carefully now. "You have the face of someone carrying heavy thoughts." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "Maybe I am." The woman nodded knowingly, while tossing more breadcrumbs. "Family trouble?" Evelyn almost asked how she knew. Instead, she simply smiled tiredly. "Something like that." The woman pointed toward the pigeons gathered around the bench. "You know what I like about birds?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head. "They don't invent status." Evelyn frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The woman chuckled softly. "That fat pigeon over there doesn't think he's superior because he found more bread." She tossed another handful across the sidewalk. "Animals survive. Humans compete." The words landed harder than Evelyn expected. "People spend their entire lives trying to feel more important than each other," the woman continued. "More money, bigger houses, better vacations, better clothes." She shrugged lightly. "And most of them die exhausted." Evelyn stared quietly ahead. "Do you know the saddest people I ever met?" the woman asked. "Who?" "The ones who had everything except enough." Silence settled between them. The pigeons fluttered noisily around their feet, while distant children laughed near the fountain. Evelyn felt something loosen deep inside her chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Relief. Because for the first time since the dinner, she no longer questioned whether she had gone too far. She hadn't destroyed anything healthy. She had exposed something rotten. The older woman stood carefully, brushing crumbs from her coat. "Well," she said cheerfully, "thank you for keeping an old woman company." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Thank you for the wisdom." The woman winked. "Oh, honey, old age isn't wisdom." She glanced back toward the pigeons. "It's just surviving long enough to recognize nonsense quickly." Then she slowly walked away beneath the trees. Evelyn remained on the bench long after she disappeared, watching people, watching life, breathing peacefully. And by the time she finally stood to leave the park, she realized something important. For the first time in years, she no longer felt the need to make herself smaller for anyone. 3 days later, someone knocked on her apartment door, and somehow, Evelyn already knew it was Claire. The knock came again. Soft, hesitant, Evelyn set her book down slowly and walked toward the apartment door. When she opened it, Claire Bennett stood in the hallway, looking nothing like the polished woman from the Grand Marlowe. No designer dress, no diamonds, no carefully styled hair. She wore jeans, white sneakers, and an oversized sweater that looked borrowed from Daniel. Her blonde hair was tied back loosely, and her face carried the exhausted vulnerability of someone who had cried too much for too many days. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Claire finally whispered, "Hi." Evelyn studied her quietly. "Hi, Claire." Claire swallowed nervously. "I know I should have called first." "You probably should have." Claire nodded immediately. "I know." Evelyn opened the door wider. "Come in." Claire stepped carefully into the apartment, looking around almost instinctively. The same apartment she had silently judged before. The old sofa. The mismatched chairs, the worn bookshelves, the tiny kitchen with chipped countertops. But this time, Evelyn noticed something different in Claire's eyes. Not judgment, understanding. Claire sat carefully on the couch while Evelyn prepared tea in the kitchen. The silence between them felt awkward, but honest. Finally, Claire spoke first. I didn't come here to defend my parents. Evelyn carried 2 mugs to the coffee table and sat across from her. I assumed you didn't. Claire wrapped both hands around the teacup, but didn't drink. For several moments, she stared down into the steam before finally speaking again. My parents grew up poor, she said quietly. Evelyn remained silent. Not regular poor, Claire continued. I mean real poverty. My mother used to tell me stories about sharing 1 pair of shoes with her sister. My grandfather worked himself to death in factories. My father grew up sleeping in a room with 6 people. Evelyn nodded slightly. That kind of childhood leaves scars. Claire laughed weakly. Scars? She looked up painfully. It shaped their entire identity. The room became quiet again. When they finally became successful, Claire continued softly, money stopped being money to them. She shook her head slowly. It became safety, power, survival, worth. Evelyn listened carefully, and eventually, Claire whispered, they started measuring everyone by the same thing. Evelyn leaned back quietly. Yes, she said. I noticed. Claire closed her eyes briefly. They weren't always cruel, she admitted. At least, I don't think they meant to become cruel. Most people don't notice when survival slowly turns into superiority, Evelyn replied calmly. Claire looked at her immediately. That's exactly it. Tears filled her eyes again. I spent my entire life trying to impress them, she confessed. Good grades, perfect appearance, the right schools, the right friends, the right husband. She gave a broken little laugh. Everything felt like performance reviews. Evelyn said nothing because she understood more than Claire probably realized. And the worst part, Claire whispered, I became just like them sometimes. Now Evelyn looked directly at her. Claire wiped her eyes quickly. I judged people, she admitted. Quietly, internally, by clothes, by neighborhoods, by careers. Shame flooded her face. Not because I wanted to, but because it was normal in my family. The honesty surprised Evelyn. Most people protected their pride before their truth. Claire continued quietly. But watching you at that dinner, she shook her head slowly. It felt like someone shattered a mirror in front of me. Evelyn folded her hand gently in her lap. What exactly did you see? Claire answered immediately. Peace. The word hung softly between them. You weren't intimidated? Claire said. You weren't desperate to impress anyone. Even when my parents insulted you, you stayed calm. Her voice trembled slightly. I've never seen that kind of strength before. Evelyn smiled sadly. It took me a long time to become this calm. Claire looked around the apartment again. My mother would hate this place, she admitted quietly. I know. But you love it. Yes. Claire frowned slightly. How? Evelyn almost laughed. What do you mean, how? It's so simple. Evelyn leaned back thoughtfully. Claire, she said gently, there's a difference between living simply and living poorly. Claire stayed silent. I can afford luxury, Evelyn continued calmly. I simply don't need it to feel valuable. That sentence hit Claire visibly hard. Your parents, Evelyn continued carefully, spent their whole lives escaping poverty. I understand that fear. But somewhere along the way, they confused wealth with worth. Claire lowered her head. Yes. And now, Evelyn said softly, they are terrified of anything that reminds them where they came from. Silence filled the apartment. Then Claire looked up again, eyes red but clear. I don't want to become them. Evelyn studied her carefully. For the first time since the dinner, she truly believed her. Claire took a shaky breath. Daniel and I set boundaries, she said quietly. No more financial control. No more manipulation. No more comments about status or money. And your parents? Claire gave a sad smile. They think I betrayed them. Evelyn nodded once. That's what controlling people call it when you stop obeying. Claire stared at her for a moment before whispering something almost painfully honest. Will I ever stop hearing their voices in my head? Evelyn's expression softened deeply. Eventually, she answered quietly. But first, you have to replace those voices with your own. Claire's tears finally fell again, and this time, Evelyn moved beside her on the couch instead of remaining across the room. Not because Claire was perfect, not because the past disappeared, but because growth deserved compassion when it was real. And for the first time in her life, Claire Bennett was finally learning the difference between having money and having character. The weeks after the dinner changed everything. Not dramatically at first, quietly. Slowly, like winter melting 1 degree at a time. Daniel and Claire stopped attending every Bennett family gathering. The endless luxury dinners, charity galas, and carefully photographed brunches slowly disappeared from their calendar. At first, Victoria treated it like a temporary rebellion. Then came the guilt. Long emotional messages, passive-aggressive comments, family group chats filled with phrases like, "After everything we sacrificed for you, families should stay loyal. You'll understand when you're older." Claire almost broke several times. Evelyn could see it happening. Years of conditioning did not disappear overnight, but Daniel remained steady beside her. And little by little, Claire learned something entirely new. Love without control. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 2 months after the dinner at the Grand Marlowe, Daniel and Claire visited Evelyn together. This time, there was no tension when they entered the apartment, no embarrassment, no silent judgment. Claire walked directly into the kitchen, carrying grocery bags, and smiled naturally. "We brought lunch." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You cooked?" Claire laughed softly. "Attempted to." Daniel leaned toward his mother and whispered dramatically, "Prepare yourself emotionally." Evelyn laughed harder than she had in weeks. And in that moment, something inside the apartment changed completely. It no longer felt like a place Daniel hid from people. It felt like home. The three of them spent the afternoon cooking badly, arguing over recipes, drinking wine from ordinary glasses, and laughing over burned garlic bread. No designer handbags, no expensive watches, no performances. Just people, real people. At one point, Evelyn quietly stepped into the hallway while Daniel searched the kitchen cabinets for more plates. Claire followed her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Claire looked toward the living room where Daniel stood humming while setting the table. "He's happier," Claire said softly. Evelyn nodded. "So are you." Claire smiled faintly. "I didn't realize how exhausted I was before." The honesty in her voice carried no bitterness now, only clarity. Claire leaned lightly against the hallway wall. "My parents still think this is a phase." Evelyn looked at her calmly. "And what do you think?" Claire smiled sadly. "I think they built beautiful prisons." Silence settled between them. Then Claire continued quietly. "They still don't understand why money stopped working on us." Evelyn's expression softened. "That's because they spent their whole lives believing money was the highest form of power." Claire nodded slowly. "But peace is stronger." Evelyn looked at her with quiet pride. Now she understands. Later that evening, after dinner ended and Daniel and Claire finally left the apartment, Evelyn stood alone beside the living room window. Outside, Boston glowed beneath orange sunset light. Cars moved slowly through crowded streets below, while distant building windows reflected gold against the darkening sky. Her apartment remained exactly the same. The old couch, the worn shelves, the chipped kitchen counter. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Evelyn thought about Victoria and Richard Bennett. They still lived in their enormous house filled with polished marble floors and expensive silence. They still attended exclusive parties, still collected luxury watches, still measured success in numbers, appearances, and status. But despite all their money, they remained emotionally hungry people, trying desperately to fill invisible emptiness with visible things. And suddenly, Evelyn no longer felt anger toward them, only distance. Because people like Victoria and Richard could only change if they wanted truth more than pride. And most people never reached that point. Evelyn poured herself one final cup of tea and sat quietly on the couch. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Daniel. "Thank you for everything, Mom. For teaching us what actually matters." A second message arrived moments later from Claire. "You saved me from becoming someone I would have hated one day." Evelyn smiled gently and placed the phone beside her. Then she leaned back and closed her eyes. For years, she had hidden herself to protect others from the corrupting influence of money. But now she finally understood something important. True wealth was never about what sat inside bank accounts. It was freedom, peace, honesty, dignity, the ability to sleep peacefully at night without needing strangers to admire your life. Victoria and Richard Bennett had millions of dollars, but Evelyn Harper had something infinitely rarer. She had authenticity. She had love. She had peace. And in the end, peace was the only kind of wealth that truly mattered.